Today in this session, we will have, it's our great pleasure to have Dr. Kevin here to give us a talk about data disclosure. Dr. Kevin Walby is the Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at the University of Winnipeg. As the Director of the Center for Access to Information and Justice, he is the leading scholar and practitioner in understanding and negotiating access to information regime in Canada and around the world. He has published many papers and reports on research using freedom of information. Working on the shared IDGs project with Dr. Chris Kirk, he has also extended his analysis to explore how social activists skillfully negotiate different institutions in getting access to information. So now I will give space to Kevin.
Thank you so much. Okay, everybody, thanks for being here. Good to see you all. Today, I'm going to talk about access to information or freedom of information and how it intersects with the struggles of social movements and social science research design. I'll talk about 7 steps involved in making a freedom of information request, 6 kinds of designs, 5 problems people might run into when they're using ATI or FOI, and 3 kinds of imaginaries for envisioning ways of putting all these pieces together. And I'll just kind of talk about the basics of FOI basically, because I know a lot of other folks later today are going to dig deeper into these issues. So I started using freedom of information at a public interest research group, or PIRG. And I think quite a few people do, because PIRGs have this tradition of using FOI and have this tradition of kind of blending investigative journalism with social science research. And since then, I've been using access to information and freedom of information to investigate government conduct. When I use access to information, I'm referring in Canada to federal level freedom of information law, and FOI refers to everything else, freedom of information at the provincial level, territorial, municipal levels. In the US, it's often called FOIA or FOI. In other countries, freedom of information. So freedom of information generally, ATI specifically refers to federal level use in Canada. And I've been using this with some colleagues, with some collaborators, with journalists, with activists, a whole bunch of people on like teams to investigate trends. Also with ATI and FOI itself, like, is it working well? Is it kind of deteriorating, falling apart? Can we even use this anymore? Does it produce good data for social movement struggles, for social science research? Good question. As you probably know, the purpose of it, the goal of ATI or FOI is to give us a right to make a request for records under the control of any government agency. That's really all it gives us. It gives us the right to make the request. It doesn't guarantee that we'll get any records. As I'll talk about, and as other folks will talk about today, there's all kinds of barriers and challenges that we will encounter. I do think, however, that these kinds of requests can be incorporated into research. And I think that these can be very useful for all kinds of qualitative and quantitative research designs, no matter where someone is working, whether you're working in academia or in journalism or in activism, you can locate some qualitative and quantitative data from this live archive. I think of government records as a kind of live archive. The archive is always being added to, the files are always being kind of modified, the names of the files or records are always being kind of twisted around. Sometimes there's games bureaucrats play to make it trickier for us to find records in the live archive, but it is an archive that's always being populated every day with records. And as researchers, it's our kind of fun task to go into the live archive and find these materials for our inquiries or for our struggles. So here's the 7 parts of the process. I'll just briefly talk about some of these. I'm sure you're familiar with most of this, but I'll just go through the 7 parts of the process just to set a kind of baseline for the day, and other people will definitely be building on this So first thing is crafting your request. You want to know what you're looking for. You want to know what agencies have it, what unit within the agency might have it, what kinds of personnel might be in custody of that record. You want to know the names of the records. You want dates. You want whatever you can get. You want the most precise information you can to craft your request. You can make broad requests. I started out making broad requests, and a lot of times those flop. If you ask for all records over a 3-year span from whatever agency, they'll just be like, no, that's too big, or no, that's going to cost you $10,000. So broad requests, they're often too big. So you kind of want to narrow in, and it takes a bit of time to get narrow. It takes a bit of time to get specific. So you have to see what journalists have already found, see what other activists have already found, see what other academics have already found, and kind of narrow in that way. So I'm always trying to work toward a set of narrow requests, even if I start out with a couple of broad requests. A lot of times we're asking for specific records. So like some emails or some meeting minutes or a PowerPoint slide from a government presentation. But more and more people are asking for data, asking for data sets, CSV files from government agencies. So I would distinguish between asking for records and asking for data. And probably in a lot of requests going forward, we're looking for some combo of records and data. And if we can get data in a raw form, if we can get data in the CSV or however they put it in there, then we can actually work with these government data sets and kind of turn them against themselves in some ways. Then there's also meta FOI requests. That's when you make a request on your request. So if you got a request number, it's like request number 123, well, it generated some records within the agency where you submitted it. So it might have been sent to the head of the agency or a superintendent, and they might be emailing inside like, who is this? What is this request? This is weird. What are we going to do about this? And if you can make a request on your request, a meta FOI request, sometimes you can access some of the backstage banter of government officials. You can see what they're saying about you. If you are an activist or a critical researcher or a journalist, you can see, are they red filing or amber lighting? These are the terms that are used to refer to the politically contentious requests. And that can also give you a lot of insight into how these agencies are managing the records and how they're trying to manage their PR as well. So you want precise wording, and whether you're working for records or data, meta FOI requests, you want to be as precise as possible. And there's also some specialized terms that you really can't anticipate what they'll be, but you just come across them as you do more and more requests. So like, for example, in some research on how CSIS and some subsidiary units like ITAC were engaged in security intelligence operations for the Vancouver Olympics, we found out that they were using this really weird term, multi-issue extremism to refer to activists, to refer to land defenders and water protectors, raging grannies. All kinds of people were getting lumped into this one category, multi-issue extremism. We'd never even heard of it. Like, what an odd term. So we started to then look for this term or look for this category in other sorts of records and other kinds of fonts. So we started to make narrow requests, specific requests about multi-issue extremists. We've never heard of it. Sometimes you come across this precise wording, and when you do, that's a real clue for something else to make a request on. We didn't start out looking for that, but the whole project ended up being focused on, like, what are they saying about multi-issue extremists? Who do they lump into this odd category? And what kinds of problems does that create for the groups themselves? when they get targeted by police and security and surveillance agencies because they fall into this category, multi-issue extremist. Next part, once you've figured out the wording and whether you're going for records or data, you're going to submit. This part is pretty boring. It's either in the mail, increasingly it's online. These online portals, they're meant to be easier to access, but actually I find them somewhat more tricky. There could be fees. Every different jurisdiction has different fees. So it could be $5, could be $25. In Alberta, it's $25. So it like impedes your ability to be systematic in making a lot of requests in Alberta, or it could be free in some jurisdictions. Sometimes there's specific forms you have to use, so watch out for that. I don't think there's any statutory mandate that you have to use the forms, but sometimes some agencies will be like, you must use the form. Winnipeg Police Service is always like, you must use the form, but there's actually no rule about that. So you might have to use some of these special forms. This is where it gets a little bit more interesting. The brokering process. Once you submit the request, that's not the end of the story. That's really just the beginning. Once the FOI coordinator gets your request, they're going to go to what's called the Office of Primary Interest. That's the unit or the office that you said the records are probably there. The FOI coordinator is going to go to that unit and is going to say, this person wants this, that, and the other thing. How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost in terms of search time? So this is what we call the brokering process. We're brokering access here because they're going to come back to us with an initial response. And then we could say, oh yeah, well, maybe I will change the timeline. Maybe I'll pull emails off the table if that's going to make things take really long, or you might get a fee estimate here initially. They might say, you're asking for a year worth of emails, and that actually is going to cost you $800. Plus you want these other things. So then at this point, you could still do whatever you want. You could pull some records off of the request. You can change the timeline. You can change the wording. You could add a record type, whatever you want to do. You can still change things up here in the brokering phase. So there's lots of discussion, or there should be lots of discussion, I think, at this phase, the brokering phase. And I would encourage people to take field notes on your correspondence, like every little bit of every phone conversation you have with the FOI coordinator. Take field notes like an anthropologist, not only because you're trying to account for how your research methods are working and how you put it all together, but it could actually provide some really good information if you make a complaint later to the Access to Information Commissioner or Freedom of Information Commissioner. The field notes can really be useful in a complaints phase. So once again, I think this part is kind of overlooked. A lot of people just like to throw the FOI request in there and then see what happens. But I think we should be really active in trying to broker, get some info from the coordinator. Hey, what did the unit say? Are those records there or not? Call them up 2 or 3 times. Don't feel like you're bothering them. That's kind of their job, to chat with you about these requests. So what will happen is you'll probably get an extension. They'll probably say, this is actually going to take 30 extra days. That's not unusual. You might get some really awful extensions, like with the RCMP, often I'm getting 600 days, 800 days. Sometimes it could be the case if I've asked them for some records where they have to consult with 7 other agencies. That really could take several months for them to do that. So at any rate, when you get the extension letter, you have another decision to make. Do you want to refile really quickly for a smaller number of records, smaller timeline? Do you want to make a complaint? You can actually make a complaint immediately if you receive a lengthy extension like this, or just wait it out. But if you're involved in a really pressing struggle, if you're a journalist and you need to break a story, then you can't hang around and wait for 800 days, right? So you might have to move quick and refile or change some things. If you get a big extension, you might get a nice disclosure. That would be a great surprise, just to, after 30 days, get a great disclosure. rarely happens that it occurs within 30 days, but if you get that disclosure you were looking for in 30 days, or maybe it'll be 60 days, great. Now you can look at it and you can check some parts of it out. You can see what's there. You can see what's not there. What's not there will be severed in some ways. It'll be redacted or exempted according to different sections of the Act under which you've submitted the request. So if it's kind of wiped out off of the page somehow, and they should tell you, like, we redacted this information because of section regarding personal information or privacy or ongoing criminal investigations or information obtained in confidence from another government. There's a whole bunch of sections in the Act. And at this point, again, I would say this is still a part where you can be active in trying to get more info out of this. So you can engage in like feral lawyering. You can tell the agency, actually, I think that this is a bit overbroad here. The use of this section, I think you should go back and take a look at that. You can invoke the law yourself. You can invoke sections of the law at the brokering phase or at this point, and try to leverage the sections of these various laws to gain more access to information. Now, if it all goes really badly and you get totally blocked and the fees are massive and it's just awful, bad situation, you can complain. You can always complain to the commissioner or the ombudsperson in your jurisdiction. And that's when it's good to pull out those field notes from all the conversations you've had. And again, engaging in feral lawyering, you might note some other cases where, like, the RCMP was overbroad in its application of a certain section, or another instance where the RCMP issued massive fee estimates and it was found by the commissioner to be not well founded. So here you can use some other cases from commissioner rulings or examples you might know of to, again, try to find a leverage point to gain more access to information through the complaints process. Now, you've got some disclosures, let's assume, and this is another important part. I think there's actually so many layers of meaning. There's so many layers of text, so many layers of numerical information in these records that data analysis is kind of overlooked and deserves more attention. So I think qualitatively, there's all kinds of approaches we could use, like qualitative content analysis, discourse analysis, metaphor analysis. Then in a more quantitative realm, network analysis. You can actually request the records to be disclosed in a machine readable format if available, or you can use different kinds of character recognition if you know someone or you yourself has an ability to recode some documents like this. So you can do what's called OCR the PDF and turn the PDF into a machine readable document that then you can like analyze computationally, and you can like scrape. Let's say you get a disclosure of 5,000 pages. That's actually tricky to go through just with your own eyeballs, right? But if you have the ability to OCR this PDF and then computationally kind of scrape it or analyze it in different ways, you can find patterns or trends you might not otherwise be able to just by checking it out. So data analysis is one big part of the next steps. New requests. If you see a weird term like multi-issue extremist, or you see a new kind of node in the network you're trying to explore, a new personnel or new unit, or that's a new request. And then sharing files. Like maybe this isn't so interesting to you, it wasn't what you were hoping for, but maybe another activist group, maybe another journalist, maybe another researcher might really be interested in this. So you should share these widely and don't hoard them. Some of the coolest initiatives are actually these kind of like clearing houses or repositories where people are just dumping all of their ATI, FOI disclosures, and then you can find the disclosures people found following all of these steps we've talked about so far. Okay, so just a quick example. This was in relation to the G7 summit in Quebec City in 2018, and we were interested in like the security intelligence networks that were involved in this. And Andy Crosby submitted quite a number of great ATI requests at the federal level to CSIS, to RCMP, to DND, Department of National Defense, which was very central actually in the security operations for that. So in the kind of work that we do, trying to publish sometimes, you have to write about using ATI and FOI as a research method. And there's some language to use to try to appease reviewers who might not be as familiar with this kind of thing. They're more familiar with traditional research methods. They might think, oh, ATI and FOI, that's just something that journalists do. But even for reports to community, even when journalists are using ATI and FOI, I think it's good to have some kind of an appendix or something where you're accounting for your research design and methods, how you decided on certain steps, how you brought other kinds of data together, just to be transparent and clear about how you're using these tools. So again, we're interested in national level coordination and like integrated summit security operations. So that's what all the requests were focused on. And that's kind of what we found. We found these different units like the ISU were brought together. Even in the early training phases, they were called Sentinel. So once we found out, oh, the training was called Sentinel, that's a whole bunch of new requests. All we can get on Sentinel-1, everything we can get on Sentinel-2. So that's an example where you find the precise wording and then you follow that kind of lead. And then these are examples of some of the text you'll get. I won't go too deep in it. It's a lot of material there, but you can see you get the kind of mini occurrence reports of some of these security intelligence operatives. You see how they're encoding certain kind of groups. Like you see, oh, the anarchists, they're all dressed in black, right? And you can see that that's operating in a lot of text. Like they start to encode social movement groups in particular ways, and they even have like a semiotic system for like finding them in the streets and in the parks of Quebec City. And then you can also see what's not there. You can see here they have exempted some material. It doesn't tell us, it should tell us right here, like section 19 should tell us right here, but it doesn't. So that's kind of a limit of these files, and there's lots of limits, which we'll get to in just a second. Here's another kind of file. So who would know that they would call their daily kind of summary reports hot washes? I don't know what that even means. I don't want to know, but that's what they call them. And so once you find that out, hot washes, who's making the hot washes? Who is writing the hot washes? Who gets the hot washes? Who sends them around? Well, okay, that's great. Let's follow that. So that's another kind of specific term and record type that you can just search for. And you could do a whole project just on the hot washes that these people are producing at the Summit Security Command Center. And then you can also start to get some numerical data. So you can find out like how they're counting things, who they're counting, why they're counting them. And this could lead you toward some data. Like if here you find some kind of database is mentioned, some kind of CSV files or Excel files or in-house coded quantitative files are mentioned, then that's another place to go for requests. And so there might be clues in here about some quantitative material or some data to make requests for. So that's just an example of kind of the types of records you might get, things to look for in them, and what you can do with them. So overall, I think that ATI and FOI requests are pretty neat in terms of what you can do with them. Here's just a list of ways that you can combine them also with other types of data you might be more familiar with or that might be more accessible, like comparing what is in FOI disclosures, which you can kind of think of as the backstage of government communication, like what are government workers saying behind the scenes, to what they're saying on the front stage. What are they saying in terms of rhetoric in news media? And then you can kind of juxtapose them and maybe call them out when you find discrepancies. Open source website data, again, it's kind of like front stage government presentation of self with the backstage material. What are they really saying behind the scenes in emails or in meeting minutes or PowerPoints? Social media data, again, government is now various governments are more active now on social media trying to frame issues. I look a lot at police services, which are trying to frame certain issues on Twitter or Instagram in particular ways. And then I compare that to FOI disclosures. What are they saying behind the scenes? Interview data. So again, you can compare what government personnel say about a certain topic in an interview with what they say about it or do about it behind the scenes. FOI data, archival data. So you can compare something in a historical archive with records you find in this live archive, and create kind of like a longitudinal research design. And even ethnographic data, like a lot of activists, you're engaged in participatory kinds of action research, and it's part of your life, it's part of your struggles, and it's part of your research. Like, it's all mixed up, and FOI disclosures can be part of that too. So these are just some of the research designs that you could think of. I'm sure that there are others, and I think some of the groups coming later today will talk about some of the awesome stuff that they're doing in terms of designing studies in this realm too. So that all sounds like, wow, we could really find some good records here using ATI and FOI. This is gonna be great. Well, actually, there's a lot of challenges. The biggest challenge, I think, has to do with communication. A lot of times as ATI, FOI users, we just kind of lob it in there, just kind of throw the request in there, and then we just sit back, and then we get frustrated when it doesn't work. And as I said, I think we should be more active in trying to broker access, and part of that is communication. So part of it's on us, like we should just communicate more with FOI coordinators and just chat with them more. But part of it's also on FOI coordinators. There's something called the duty to assist in Canadian access law. And I think that FOI coordinators often don't take their duty to assist very seriously. And this is actually a finding of FOI commissioners across the provinces. Like, it's becoming a trend. The duty to assist requires that they communicate fully, clearly, immediately all factors pertaining to their requests that they are aware of, including the information that they get from the Office of Primary Interest to you, the requester. But it doesn't happen. There's not great communication. So I think that's where it starts to break down, is we're not doing a good job communicating. They're not taking the duty to assist seriously. It's like a relationship. It takes a lot of work to communicate every day to make it actually be good. So you have to communicate, and you have to try to get them to take the duty to assist seriously too. There are some other challenges that have to do with like the law itself and the nature of bureaucracy, I think. So some of the delays, even if you have good communication, the delays might be on the back end of it, like in the Office of Primary Interest itself. Sometimes they just don't want to release those records. If your request gets amber lighted or red filed, then a political operative in the ministry or in the agency has told that unit not to release those files or not to release them in full. So the delays could be happening at any kind of level inside, and same with the redactions and exemptions. If you ever get a disclosure and it's totally whited out or blacked out, that could be another indicator that this has been a red filed or amber lighted request, and it's been severed completely by the agency. So this happens a lot, and it's kind of out of the FOI coordinator's hands. It might be some kind of political operation happening. So these are all challenges that you're going to encounter and that FOI users who've been doing this for a year still encounter every time they make a request. And then one of the other items I think to watch for in the years ahead has to do with automation and digitization. A lot of governments are starting to digitize their communication streams within their various units, and they're starting to automate the FOI process. So in theory, this sounds like a good thing. In theory, it sounds like it could make it more efficient or quicker or better for citizen access, but I really don't buy any of that. I think that automation and digitization is being driven by like outside corporate interests that are just trying to monetize information streams within government. And then I think the whole live archive becomes more opaque to the people inside of government and to people outside of it too. So you'll hear a lot about digitization and automation of government information. The most recent reforms to the access to information system at the federal level focused almost exclusively on digitizing federal government records. And even according to the Treasury Board's own statistics on this, access times have not been improved, access depth of disclosure has not been improved. Some agencies have actually gotten worse after the digitization initiative brought in by Trudeau. So I don't think digitization of government records will make it easier or more clear or less secret. In fact, these things could actually get worse. Maybe the biggest challenge is actually that a lot of government agencies don't take their duty to document seriously. This is the biggest problem, I think. Government agencies en masse have a duty to document all kinds of decisions they're making, all their communications. And this is from an RCMP ATI training session. The training session was telling basically all the RCMP personnel in the offices of primary interest how to deal with ATI requests. And this was the first slide. How can you avoid an ATIP request? So it goes on like keeping your meeting minutes brief, things like that. So it's about trying to dissuade government workers from documenting their decisions in a thorough manner, which is a real problem, right? Because all we have to go on if we're using ATI and FOI is the documentation of their decisions and their conduct and how they're governing people's lives. So beyond the challenges with ATI and FOI specifically, I think just the lack of documentation within government presents another kind of barrier or challenge to using ATI and FOI and, really trusting the process. You want to trust that these data tell you something about what's going on, but when you start to peel back the layers and you start to understand that there's all the challenges with redaction and exemption, and then maybe half of the documents that should be there aren't there because they weren't produced to begin with. Like you can see, there's major gaps in the live archive. Okay, so last thing I wanted to touch on was there's so many awesome social movement groups and also investigative journalists and some academics who've been using ATI and FOI in various jurisdictions to investigate government conduct, to aid in different mobilizations, fighting for different forms of social justice. And these are just some of the groups that I've learned from and heard about. And looking at what these groups are doing and what some investigative journalists are doing these days, I just wanted to end on like three imaginaries, what I'm calling three imaginaries, but like what I'm seeing in different groups doing, which is really exciting because I think this is what these groups are doing is actually the next direction or the next level for how to use ATI and FOI in research in any domain. So the first imaginary is a geographic imaginary. So trying to find not just records or data, but asking specifically about geocoded data, trying to find like how government agencies think about territory and space and using this geographic imaginary, wording requests so that you can find the ways that government agencies are geocoding their governance practices, right? And I think the focus on space really came out in the talks yesterday, like trying to get down to a block by block level or house or residence by residence level, like that's really geocoded. But a lot of times, for instance, there is spatial data in some of the records that, for instance, I might ask for, but I've just been overlooking it, like in occurrence reports, in police officer occurrence reports or security intelligence occurrence reports. Oftentimes there is a location. Oftentimes there is an address or something where an occurrence happened. So if I just start to reimagine these data or reimagine the requests following the lead of different social movement groups, looking for geocoded data might reveal a whole other layer of governance and other kind of operations of power that are kind of like spread out in city spaces. And then the second imaginary, instead of focusing on geocoded data, focusing on big data, what people are calling big data, and here, like using a computational imaginary. So this could include looking for actual data sets that government have, like whatever way they've created them. They're probably not always going to be in a off-the-shelf format like CSV or Excel. A lot of times these days, they're going to be coding them in-house. They're going to be coding their own databases in-house. So thinking about wording for how to access those databases that they've coded in-house so that the request doesn't get denied, so that you can access the records. Accessing data that you can manipulate yourself. So it's not just like a static Excel file, like something that you can actually go into and work with and kind of re-engineer if you want. And then also like rendering the records that you do get accessible to computational analysis, whether it's yourself or working in partnership with someone else who has computational skills to like do something like topic modeling or sentiment analysis or scrape the big disclosures that you get, any kind of techniques like that. So working with the disclosures in ways that computational analysis maybe extends. So the geospatial kind of computational, and then a kind of counter surveillance imaginary. And here it's not geospatial data. It's not big data. It's dirty data, like data that might be potentially embarrassing to government officials, where you can really call out an agency or a unit or a government worker for something that they've done that is creating injustice in the world, like creating a list of people who work for CERG or something like that. The community industry response group that is just like attacking people in Wet'suwet'en and at Fairy Creek and in other places of resource extraction. We have no idea really who works for CERG or even what CERG is, this community industry response group that RCMP has created, but that's if someone could access some dirty data on who is in CERG, where are they working, what kinds of training do they come with, like from military, etc. That would be an example of like counter surveillance imaginary or some dirty data that could be put together. So anyway, those three imaginaries, kind of geographic imaginary, computational imaginary, counter surveillance imaginary, I think that those are like some critical motivations for designing future ATI FOI research. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they can be used together to create some really amazing research to foster future mobilization. So that's it from me. Thanks for everyone for organizing this event, and thanks for being here. Yeah, that's a tricky one when they use in-camera process, or when at the federal level or even provincial level, there's like cabinet confidences. Those are tricky to get around. So um, trying to find some kind of trace of the communication in some other record, if one can locate like some other kinds of record exhaust or data exhaust that they produce a month after said meeting or something like that. That would be something to look for. But also, I think just advocating for ATI and FOI laws to change. I mean, these laws are totally malleable. We could actually change them. There's no reason for cabinet competences to be there or for those kinds of in-camera meeting competences to be there either. So a lot of times social movement groups maybe don't think like, hey, mobilizing around FOI is that important? And I get it, because the on the ground front line, keeping people alive struggles are way more important than trying to amend some law. But if we could sometimes amend some of these sections of the laws, it might actually have a big impact on what we can know in the future about some government agencies. Yeah, that's another kind of gap, I think, because anytime that there's a private player involved in some kind of communication chain, then they could claim third party exemptions. And this happens the more there are public-private partnerships, that the more these communication chains get taken off of the table, because they'll just say, well, there's a corporate player. However, I have found that sometimes access to information still will produce information on those private public partnerships. I think that's where the communication part of it can come into play. If you have a good relationship with the FOI coordinator, because I think they're using discretion when they're applying some of those sections around third parties, for instance. So yeah, I have gotten surprisingly some disclosures on private public partnerships that I didn't think would come through. And somehow they just get released. So it's not a total ban. It's still useful, but there are challenges, and that is another kind of element where advocacy around ATI and FOI could change that. In some countries, that information is not exempted. In some countries, information from private parties and from not-for-profits and charities like police foundations, it is on the table because their laws are just constructed a little differently. And if it's a record in the custody of a government, then it can be disclosed. So that's another place where our laws are like kind of too restrictive. And I think more FOI advocacy, we could actually change that. I would just leave it kind of open, and I mean, people engaged in local struggles probably know best about where some kind of governance or control or surveillance is happening, and then just kind of working backwards from that. Like, how is the state, how are government agencies kind of spatially mapping this out, and then trying to get their maps, trying to get their spatial data. But I would say, yeah, it just depends on the struggle or depends on the research question, but it could be anything. Like, who knows what kinds of data, what kinds of records are spatially tagged in some way. And then once you figure out how they tag them, you can get it and you can analyze it in any kind of way, produce maps like we saw yesterday, or just analyze it in some other way. Yeah, I think the possibilities are really kind of wide open in terms of looking at how government spatially tags all the records in their custody. Yeah, so every agency is a little different, and every FOI coordinator is a little different. Some FOI coordinators have training in FOI law or archives or data science, and they take their job really seriously, and they're on the side of trying to promote transparency, even though their hands are kind of tied in some ways. And they're pretty good to talk to, and they might give you lots of info. You could call them 3 or 4 times, and they might tell you a lot about the file structure of some agency, which gives you clues for new requests. It's not always possible to have a good relationship, though, with FOI coordinators. Like with the RCMP, sometimes the FOI coordinators or personnel are seconded officers, right? So they're not super interested in talking with me about FOI or disclosing government records. And a lot of times with small municipalities or provinces too, the people in the FOI offices might be new to the office. They might not have training in FOI. They might not even know the law as good as you do. They might not know it inside out. So again, you might have to do some feral lawyering and like educate them on, well, this is like the precedent. This is how this section works. I used this section last year. How come it's not playing the same way this year? Things like that. So I would say it's something to strive for, open communication with them and trying to figure out what's going on with the records through chatting with them. But sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes it can become really adversarial. Like I'm sure people who've used FOI in the room have had some of those adversarial FOI coordinators where you feel like they're just already not interested in and trying to dissuade you in different ways, and they're playing different games, issuing fee estimates and talking about, oh, this is going to take years and stuff like that. Then your hands are kind of tied. You can request to move on to a different FOI coordinator or like there's usually an office of 6 or 7 people, but that's one thing you could do is ask for another FOI staff member to take over your request if you have a frosty relationship with the person you're currently working with. Yeah. And there's a couple other strategies you can use, like CCing the city records manager or people like that sometimes. And if the communications get really tense and you feel like they're not being professional or following FOI law, you could bring in some other people who kind of oversee their work, because they're going to get implicated in it eventually if you make a complaint. So yeah, there's a few strategies where maybe you become a little bit more adversarial in trying to broker access, but I always try to start out in a friendly way, and then if it doesn't end up being super friendly, then you can be feral in your lawyering if you have to. Yeah, it's a little bit different in Canada. It is limited to citizens' permanent residents, I believe, and all the time in research on police, especially at local county levels. So people from outside of the U.S. can use FOI in the U.S. and it's actually like a smooth process. They're not like flummoxed by this weird Canadian making requests to some small town that they're totally like, yeah, FOI, that's what it's here for. And that's a good question, because that gets into like the political nature of the agency's response. I think they're not supposed to be collecting information about us as FOI users. They're not supposed to be sharing it with the Office of Primary Interest or any political operatives, but I'm pretty sure that they do pretty frequently. So I think that when you make a request, all you have to provide really, if you're doing it in writing, is your address, which in and of itself is actually kind of like, if you're involved in some frontline activism, like maybe you don't want to put your address on there. Maybe you want to farm that request out to someone like our center does requests for activist groups because they don't want to put their addresses on it, and I totally get it. So that's why we do it. Or farm it out to a journalist or a lawyer or somebody. So the address, the name, if it's an online submission, your credit card number, right? So maybe you don't want to give them all that info. Maybe you want to get someone else to make the request sometimes. You can work with them on a team, like teams of activists, academics, journalists could work together and be strategic. Like, you should do this one because I don't want that agency to have my address, etc.